The original Lethal Weapon movie, released in 1987, was a watershed moment in action movie history. It borrowed heavily from police action movies and television shows that came before, films like Dirty Harry and shows like Starsky and Hutch. It mixed those ingredients well to create something with its own unique identity. It spawned 3 sequels and a short-lived reboot television show, not to mention the parody Loaded Weapon 1. It also helped cement the buddy cop action subgenre. Movies like Tango and Cash, Bad Boys and its sequels, Rush Hour and its sequels, Ride Along and countless others, those movies owe a great deal to Lethal Weapon and its sequels. It has some interesting connections to the Die Hard franchise. Along with Die Hard, Lethal Weapon helped change the way people view action movies and change the way people make action movies even today. I was born in the late 1970s, which made me a teenager in the 90s, not the 80s, so I did not see this movie in the theater. I was just a bit too young. My first exposure to it came as a VHS rental in the early part of the 1990s. I've seen this film a number of times since then, but it's been a while since I've watched it, at least a dozen years. Well, I just finished rewatching it, and with fresh eyes and a fresh perspective, I have a few thoughts I'd like to share. Here are the top things I find interesting about the original Lethal Weapon film. Before we get started, my name is Eric Wilfred Watson. I have 2 action thriller novels on sale at Amazon.com. Your purchase of one or more of these books helps support this channel. Don't forget to click the thumbs up button if you like this video, and if you don't like this video, please hit the thumbs down button twice. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. And of course, this video contains spoilers. Lethal Weapon is the story of Martin Riggs, an LAPD cop played by Mel Gibson. He's a recent widower, and he's suicidal due to the depression he's feeling at the recent loss of his wife. It is affecting his job, and no one wants to partner with him. Everyone thinks he's crazy. Roger Murtaugh is played by the legendary Danny Glover. He's the unlikely one who's stuck with Riggs as his partner. Neither one of these cops wants to be paired with each other, but over the course of this film, especially after the terrible things they go through together, they become close friends. The movie opens up with the song Jingle Bell Rock playing during the opening credits sequence. Everyone who's even remotely interested in action movies from this era is familiar with the "Is Die Hard a Christmas movie" controversy. I find it interesting that this film is overlooked in that regard. Both Die Hard and Lethal Weapon take place in Los Angeles during Christmas time. Both films open and close with Christmas music, and the holiday is referenced throughout both movies. The first time we see the Martin Riggs character played by Mel Gibson in this movie, he's working undercover buying cocaine from drug dealers who are also selling Christmas trees as a front. Snow, Christmas trees, was that an intentional pun? Anyway, he demonstrates that he's nuts by showing almost no regard for his own safety during the bust, and acting like an insane person. But before that scene, just after the opening credits, the film opens up with a woman high on cocaine falling from a balcony. Because it's the 1980s and it's an action movie, we are treated to a gratuitous shot of her bare boobs. It turns out she is the daughter of Roger Murtaugh's friend who is involved in the drug trade. The movie centers around the investigation of the drugs that killed this woman, which leads to the bad guys killing Roger Murtaugh's friend by shooting him from a helicopter before he can say anything to the police. The bad guys don't know if they killed him before he told too much to the cops, so they try to kill the cops, but they're the heroes of the film, so they obviously don't die. When the plot to kill them doesn't work, they kidnap Roger Murtaugh's teenage daughter. There's a shootout in the desert, the good guys are captured and tortured, they escape, then there's a shootout chase across Los Angeles. The main bad guy dies, but one of his henchmen, Mr. Joshua, played by the excellent Gary Busey, goes to Roger Murtaugh's house, where there is more action, a fist fight between Martin Riggs and Mr. Joshua. Eventually, Mr. Joshua dies, the heroes win, and Riggs tells Murtaugh that he is no longer suicidal and not crazy. There are a few detours and character moments along the way, such as when a person is threatening to jump off of a building to kill himself, Riggs acts crazy and jumps with the guy, landing on an inflatable cushion. This makes Roger Murtaugh think that Riggs really is suicidal and crazy. At one point in the movie, there is a joke where Riggs says Roger to Roger. Roger says, huh? And then Riggs changes what he says to 10-4. as in Roger 10-4. That reminds me of the gag in the Airplane movie. I thought that was neat that they slipped that in there. You almost don't even notice it. Another connection to Die Hard is that the 9mm Beretta prop used by Riggs was also used by Bruce Willis in the Die Hard movie, the exact same prop. This movie works because it has a serviceable plot. It's there if you want to pay attention to it, but it mostly exists as a framework to hang the action sequences on. The drug smuggling and crime plot almost doesn't matter. The bad guys could have been doing almost any illegal thing and it wouldn't have made any difference. What matters is that it impacts the characters and gives us fun to look at action sequences, shootouts, chases, and so on. What truly makes this movie work is the chemistry between Mel Gibson's Riggs and Danny Glover's Murtaugh. They are opposites in many ways. White guy, black guy. Widower, family man. Guy who acts crazy, conservative family guy. But they're both dedicated cops and want to take down the villains. They bond, and because both actors exude charisma, it's easy to believe that they would become friends if they were actually real people. Another thing I'd like to point out is that this movie excels at the setup and payoff. Lots of movies and books have sequences of events, but foreshadowing is lacking, and things that happen don't have the impact they otherwise could have because they weren't set up ahead of time. They just happen. For example, there is a humorous scene where Riggs and Murtaugh are target shooting at a police gun range. Roger Murtaugh does a quick draw and shoots the humanoid target right in the center of its head. Martin Riggs takes the same target, holds the button down while humming a ridiculous song as the target moves farther and farther away. Once it's as far back as it can possibly go, Riggs shoots the target and then hums the ridiculous song as the target comes back. When you see the target, you realize he's shot the eyes and mouth to make a smiley face from the bullet holes. He says, "Have a nice day." That isn't there just as a joke, although it works for that too. It sets up the fact that Riggs is a phenomenal shot, which comes into play later. The lethal weapon in the movie Lethal Weapon isn't a weapon, it's Riggs. Riggs is the lethal weapon in the movie. That funny little bit sticks with you, but later on when he's doing sniper work, in the climax, you truly believe that Riggs could make those shots because they established that he's a really good shot earlier in the film. It was a setup, and it had a payoff. There are other examples, but I think you get the idea. There are some things in this movie that I'm not thrilled about. It is not a perfect movie. They get a lot of the police procedural stuff wrong, which is normal in an action movie. For example, Murtaugh insists that a suspect should be shot in the leg rather than be killed. When shootings are necessary, shoot in the leg, shoot to injure, not to kill. This is silly on a number of accounts. First, there is no guarantee that a leg shot wouldn't be lethal anyway. Hit that artery and it's all over. Secondly, cops are specifically trained not to do that because the only reason you should be firing your gun is to stop an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm to yourself or others. And if you mess around by aiming for a leg, you're likely to not stop that threat in time and put your own life or innocent lives at risk. If there is that grave of a threat, shooting to wound leaves the suspect able to shoot and kill people. A wound does not stop the threat. This is illustrated by the scene where Murtaugh shoots a man in the leg near a pool, but Riggs has to kill him when the bad guy tries to shoot again at the cops. And a third reason a real-life cop wouldn't do this is that shooting pistols is hard, especially when adrenaline is pumping in a life-or-death situation. If a target isn't stationary, pun intended, shooting at a limb means a high probability of missing your target, which puts the lives of other people or yourself at risk. All police departments train cops to aim for center mass to stop the threat, because center mass is easier to hit than a limb and it is more likely to stop the threat. But most movies get police procedures wrong, so I'll give that a pass. The point was to contrast the two characters, and this did accomplish that. The next thing of note in the film is the music. I was surprised to see the name Eric Clapton in the credits. Eric Clapton, of course, is a rock and roll and blues legend. There is a lot of bluesy music in the soundtrack of this movie as opposed to traditional orchestra music. The saxophone and blues guitar work in this movie surprisingly well. That style of music sounds like cop music to some people, but this movie is what cements that and makes that the case. Finally, let's talk about the director of the film. The movie was originally offered to Spock actor Leonard Nimoy, who had not only directed Star Trek movies 3 and 4, but also the hit film 3 Men and a Baby. Leonard Nimoy turned down the project because he did not want to make a violent action movie. Eventually, the movie was given to Richard Donner. Richard Donner directed this and all of the Lethal Weapon sequels. It's fairly unusual for a multi-movie franchise to have each movie directed by the same person, so kudos to Richard Donner. Richard Donner has a rather diverse list of credits. He's most famous for having directed the original Superman movie in 1978. Before he was a feature film director, he directed tons of television episodes in the 60s and 70s, many shows you would have heard of. Other feature film credits include The Goonies, Scrooged, Maverick, Assassin, Timelines, Conspiracy Theory, and Lady Hawk. Interestingly, Lady Hawk also has unconventional music. The unconventional music works in Lethal Weapon, not so much in Lady Hawk. Lady Hawk is notorious for bad music. Overall, this movie holds up quite well to modern audiences, although its 80s-ness does show at times. The film spawned countless copycats, which attests to the strength of the movie. Why copycat a movie if the movie isn't good? I don't think it was as revolutionary for action movies as Die Hard, but that's a conversation for another day. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Lethal Weapon a revolutionary action movie? Does it still hold up today? Please like and subscribe so that you don't miss the next video. It is not very common for a sequel to a hit movie to be as good as the original movie or even better than the original movie. Some exceptions would be The Dark Knight, which is a superior film to Batman Begins. Terminator 2 is better remembered than the original Terminator. I personally prefer Aliens over the original Alien. There are other examples, and I think Lethal Weapon 2 might just fall into this category. I don't think it's quite as well remembered as the original film, but I think Lethal Weapon 2 deserves its props as a successful sequel. So let's get into it. Why is Lethal Weapon 2 one of the better sequel movies out there? Lethal Weapon 2 had an uphill battle to climb in order to reach what the original movie did. But did it succeed? Well, the answer is yes and no. The original Lethal Weapon movie had Martin Riggs, a suicidal cop who lost his wife and was feeling depressed, but by the end of the movie, he seems to have gotten over his issues, in large part with the help from his partner, Detective Murtaugh. They developed a bond in the first movie. With the second movie, that relationship having been established in the original movie, they can get going with the action right away, and the movie wastes zero time getting into it. You see Mel Gibson punching the ceiling of a car going, woohoo! As they're driving super fast in a high-speed chase, they go right into the action. They don't even have opening credits. It's just the movie begins, we're already in the thick of it. We don't know all the details. We don't know who the bad guys are, but it's pretty clear that they're very dangerous. We get a helicopter with a machine gun. And it all culminates in a car crash where the bad guy's vehicle is discovered to have been filled with gold coins. And thus begins the mystery of the film. What are these gold coins all about, and what is going on? It turns out that a South African diplomat is a drug dealer, and he has diplomatic immunity. So that's the plot of the movie, trying to get around the diplomatic immunity and trying to get the bad guys before the bad guys can get the cops. Once the South African drug lords realize that the cops are onto them, they start killing cops. So obviously, Riggs and Murtaugh are put in danger. There are a lot of interesting sequences in the movie that are fun and hold up over time. Of course, there's the famous bomb in the toilet sequence, which of course was parodied in Loaded Weapon 1 starring Emilio Estevez and Samuel L. Jackson.
What's wrong?
Nothing. Taking a shit.
Lethal Weapon 2 succeeds in a couple of areas. Number one, it improves upon the villains of the first movie. Gary Busey was a henchman of the bad guy of the original film, Mr. Joshua, but Gary Busey's Mr. Joshua wasn't the main villain. Now, when the henchman outshines the villain, that's not a good sign that you've written a great villain. The villain in the original Lethal Weapon movie was actually somewhat forgettable. What was great in the original movie was the character development and how Murtaugh and Riggs became friends, This movie continues that, where the friendship grows and deepens. The other reason the movie succeeds is because the characters are already the characters we know from the original film. One of the reasons The Dark Knight is a superior movie to Batman Begins is because Batman is Batman through the entire movie. Likewise, in Lethal Weapon 2, Riggs and Murtaugh are already the characters we know. We still get character development and we still get interesting dialogue establishing who these people are, so you don't need to have watched the first movie to watch the second movie, but it's great to see the characters being who they are right from the beginning through the end of the film. It saves time for more interesting things like more action sequences and more character development and more time spent with the villains. The villain has more dialogue, the villain has more stuff to do, the villain has a more well laid out plan. The third reason this movie works really well is because it introduces a new character in the form of Leo Getz.
Okay, come on. Hey, loosen up a little bit, you guys. Come on, we're going to be together a long time.
Played by the one and only magnificent Joe Pesci. Leo Getz is annoying. He's sort of the Jar Jar Binks of the movie, but that's okay. He's actually quite a likable character, even though he's extremely annoying. As a matter of fact, you actually feel somewhat sorry for Leo Getz, as Murtaugh and Riggs don't treat him very well. It's actually a little off-putting. He attaches himself to these two people because they're his protectors, and as annoying as he is, the three of them do develop a bond throughout the film, which is rather fun to watch. The movie does go a little over the top at times, which is to be expected in an action film. There's a sequence where Leo Getz and Riggs fall out the window of a hotel room and splash into a pool several stories below, which is somewhat ridiculous, but it works. One thing that's interesting about that sequence, though, is if you look in the background, you'll see a high-rise building, which was the Nakatomi Plaza in the Die Hard movie. So that's one more thing that connects these two franchises. Another reason this movie works is there's an interesting retcon. In the original film, we show that Riggs' wife was killed in a car accident, but in this movie, we realize that it wasn't an accident at all. Bad guys in this movie were targeting Riggs when they crashed into his car, but they accidentally killed his wife instead. So that gives extra motivation for Riggs to chase down the bad guys, even though they technically have diplomatic immunity. There is a romance in this movie. Riggs falls for a woman who works for the bad guys, but she herself isn't a villain. She's just working for the South African government doing her job, and she's not a fan of the apartheid government, so she and Riggs hook up. But Hollywood trope, she gets killed primarily so that Riggs can be sad about it and take his revenge on the bad guys. So these people took two women from him, his wife and the woman he fell in love with in this film. Extra motivation for him to kill all the bad guys, which him and his partner definitely get around to by the end of the film. This movie has an interesting setup and payoff where there's a jokey sequence where he's wearing a straitjacket in the police station with a bet that he can free himself within a certain amount of time. He has a shoulder injury where he can dislodge his shoulder at any time, which allows him to escape from the straitjacket and thus winning the bet. Later in the movie, the bad guys dump him in the ocean, chained up with the intention of drowning him, but that same shoulder injury allows him to escape those chains in a rather Houdini-like fashion. Unfortunately, that's where he finds his dead girlfriend. As cliche as some of these storytelling tools are, they do work in this film, and it is fun to watch. The character interaction between Leo Getz, Martin Riggs, and Roger Murtaugh are all quite good. The comic relief from Leo Getz is a little bit over the top at times, but it's forgivable. Joe Pesci is just a really good actor, and even though he's over the top annoying, he's a believable character. It's not like Jar Jar Binks, as I joked about earlier. This character is believably that way. You can imagine a guy like him actually existing and him actually annoying the cops. But like I said, they get along in the end. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the movie does go a bit over the top at times. There's a sequence where Riggs pulls down a house with his pickup truck by tying it to the stilts that are holding up the house. I would think that if a pickup truck could pull that house down, a mild earthquake would do the same, and if this is Los Angeles, I'm guessing the building codes would be such where if a building was so weak that it could be pulled down by a pickup truck, it probably wouldn't have been allowed to be lived in. Nevertheless, it makes for a fascinating sequence, really good looking action. I love action movies that were filmed before the CGI era, so all of these are practical effects. The movie's climax is in a cargo ship where there's lots of shootouts, and Mr. Diplomatic Immunity gets shot and killed. He can't be prosecuted, but he can definitely get shot. Unfortunately, Riggs is also shot and apparently dying in Murtaugh's arms until he makes a joke about quitting smoking. Those things will kill ya. So we know that he'll be okay despite having been shot. And of course, in subsequent sequels, there's barely a reference to him having been shot here. Overall, I think the movie suffers from a little bit too much comedy. The comedy-action ratio is a little bit skewed towards comedy, but they both work. I wish there was more of an emphasis on action and character development and plot, and a little bit less on trying to make the audience laugh, but it was a feel-good movie. Even though it had lots of graphic violence and death and killing and shooting, it's fun to watch. It's not intended to be graphic and horrific. It's not a super gritty movie. It's not as gritty or dark as the original film, but it is more fun. So in that sense, it's a superior film. It's more fun to watch. It has more action. The characters are more developed, which makes it a superior film. But it's not quite as dark and gritty as the original. It doesn't have that aspect where Mel Gibson is the lethal weapon. His instability in the original movie is something that the second movie lacks. So I won't say this movie is absolutely superior to the original, but I will say it holds up extremely well, especially if you watch the original movie and the sequel back to back. They stand together quite well. And that, of course, brings me to Lethal Weapon 3 and 4. That will be the subject of a future video. If you want to hear that, please hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss it. And in the meantime, as a reminder, you can purchase my novel Judas Kissed and Becoming Quincy at Amazon.com. Thank you very much for watching. It almost goes without saying that the first two Lethal Weapon movies were action classics, both well-regarded, well-remembered, and appreciated decades later. I've already done videos on the first two movies, so today I'm going to focus on Lethal Weapon 3 and 4, which were more of a mixed bag than the first two films. These later sequels had some great things and some not so great things, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into it, my name is Eric Wilfred Watson. I'm the author of the supernatural crime thriller Judas Kissed and the action contemporary science fiction thriller Becoming Quincy. Both of my novels are available on Amazon.com. Your purchase of those books not only supports this channel, but it helps support an independent author. Who knows, you may even enjoy the books. Lethal Weapon 3 starts off with Riggs wanting to go into a building with a bomb in it. There's a bit of an argument, is there a bomb in the building or not? Riggs doesn't seem to believe that there is. Roger insists they wait for the bomb squad, but it's an action movie and these are the hero characters, so of course they go in. Roger reluctantly goes in even though he's only 8 days from retirement. Of course, there's the cliched, which color wire do we cut to stop the bomb? I don't know if real bomb makers use colored wires to indicate which thing does which thing. I would think that a bomb maker would use all the same color wire for all of it, but hey, what do I know? Naturally, Riggs cuts the wrong wire and the clock on the bomb starts going faster. Do bombs actually have colored wires, and are there usually clocks on them? When they cut the wrong wire, the bomb starts to go faster, so they run out of the building, and kaplooey, the building blows up. As a result of this kerfluffle, both Riggs and Murtaugh are busted down to uniformed foot patrol officers. This, of course, is played up for comedy. After tormenting a guy for jaywalking, which seemed a little unnecessary, these cops probably should have their badges taken away if this is the way they treat random people, but this was done for comedy, so we can look past it. They come across an armored car heist. Just by coincidence, there's a chase. It turns out that the bad guy who robbed the armored car was under the employ of a worse bad guy who runs a construction company and is a real estate developer. This rogue employee is killed and buried in the cement for bringing attention where it wasn't needed. More plot stuff happens. An ex-cop murders a suspect in an interrogation room. He doesn't know that there have been recently installed security video cameras, so his face is on camera. Roger stumbles across a crime, and Roger's son friend, who was shown earlier in the film, is killed. Roger feels terrible about this. It's determined that the gun used in this crime came from the theft of police evidence. Crooked cops are stealing and selling guns and other things. The movie does have a fun climax with a shootout in a housing development construction site. The weak and unmemorable villain with a vague plan is eventually killed by the police with cop killer bullets that are shot through the metal blade of a bulldozer, which is complete bullshit. The cop killer bullets introduced earlier in the film are completely ridiculous. There is such a thing as bullets meant to penetrate deeper. There are bullets that are meant to mushroom or shatter upon impact, but there is nothing that you can fire from a 9mm handgun that can do what the bullets in this movie are depicted doing. If the movie makers wanted an anti-gun message, there were far better, less silly ways to do it. I rather enjoyed the romance between Riggs and the Rene Russo character. It wasn't forced, it seemed like these two would actually connect were they real people. She's a badass, and Riggs appreciates her, and I appreciate her as being a good character, and adds a level to the film that would be missing without her. Overall, the movie is fine. It's mostly forgettable, but it's okay. It's probably the most forgettable of the 4 movies. There's nothing specifically horribly wrong with it. It just kind of plays it safe and makes mostly boring choices. I wish they had leaned into the demotion more. It would have been fun to see Riggs and Murtaugh as patrol officers trying to solve the crime rather than having the detective badge, but the movie brings them back to detective status so that the plot can happen. The demotion was almost done more for a comedy bit, but when the movie needed the story to move forward, they got their badges back almost right away. It seemed like a bit of a wasted opportunity. If you're going to do it, lean into it and really do it. What I do enjoy in this movie is the progression of the character of Martin Riggs. In the first movie, he's a suicidal widower. In the second movie, he seems to be doing better. He's willing to date again, although his girlfriend dies in the second movie. This movie starts with him a little bit in a better place. He has a romance that seems natural and unforced. He's moving past the death of his wife. In the fourth movie, he gets married and has a kid. With that in mind, let's go into Lethal Weapon 4. The fourth installment begins with a gunman in body armor on a rampage. He has a flamethrower, he has automatic weapons, and we go right into the action. Through highly unlikely exposition dialogue during this opening action sequence, we learn that Riggs is about to become a father, with the Rene Russo character from the previous movie as the mother. Roger is about to become a grandfather. After killing the bad guy and after massive explosions, we cut to almost 9 months later. Martin, Roger, and Leo are out boating and have a good time until a Chinese ship goes by and almost hits them, and then a shootout begins. It culminates in a rather large action sequence where they go ashore, and then when it's all said and done, the cops show up, including Chris Rock, a new character who shows up to investigate. Chris Rock acts rather awkwardly towards Roger Murtaugh. As a matter of fact, Chris Rock is acting a lot like Chris Rock, which in my opinion was a mistake. I understand that if you're going to cast a comedic actor like Chris Rock, you want him to act like Chris Rock, but Chris Rock has proven that he is an actor beyond that. Just watch the season of Fargo that has him in it. He's actually quite good with dramatic acting, which he doesn't really get to do in this movie. Riggs lives with his girlfriend that he started dating in the third movie, the Rene Russo character. They live by the beach. I like that it's sort of an amalgamation of Riggs's mobile home with an actual house. The character interaction between Riggs and the Rene Russo character works surprisingly well. I'm not usually a romance movie kind of guy. When they shove romance into a movie, I usually roll my eyes, especially in an action movie where it doesn't seem to fit. But in this case, it does fit. This is the fourth movie. The character is growing and developing. It makes sense that he would eventually settle down. This pairing seems to work. Those are actually some of my favorite parts of the movie, is when the movie slows down and gives us some character stuff. It really works in this movie, and that's one of the things about the fourth Lethal Weapon movie that really excels. I wish they would have done more of it. Roger Murtaugh is also a character that develops and ages and gets better over time, and one thing I appreciate about his character is the family surrounding him, which were all played by the same actors in each movie. I like that little bit of continuity. It turns out that Chris Rock's character is in a secret relationship with Roger's daughter, which I find a little bit hard to believe. It seems that his daughter and his family life is to a point where his daughter wouldn't need to keep that kind of a thing a secret from her dad. It didn't strike me as true that that's the way it would be in a tight family like that. And of course, we have to bring in the silly. Roger takes in Chinese people from the boat incident. He says that he's freeing slaves, which is true, I suppose, but it seems like there would be an actual legal process for that sort of thing, an asylum process for that sort of thing. I can't imagine a cop wanting to bring in a whole bunch of strangers from another country to live with them, but that's what they did. It seems silly, but you can go with it. His connection to the Chinese characters, especially the father, comes into play later, so that does add to the plot of the movie. The movie falls into the sequel trap where the characters become exaggerated versions of themselves and become borderline superheroes. The later Die Hard movies did this. Unfortunately, the Lethal Weapon sequels do this as well. For example, there is a chase sequence. The hero's car flies through the air, crashes into the side of an office building, plows through cubicles as people in the office building run out of the way. Riggs steps on the gas over Roger's foot to make him go faster through the office building, which is, to use a term my grandfather once used, sheer asininity. Making the whole situation even more asinine, they crash out the other side of the building through the window and land safely on the highway to resume the chase. The car still works, the airbags didn't deploy, the cops inside the car didn't die, no pedestrians were killed. It's all rather silly. We all have to suspend disbelief a little, but this kind of thing is too much, goes too far, and ruins a lot of action movies, especially sequels. While I can appreciate that this action sequence was tough to film, it involved a lot of moving pieces and was shot quite well as far as the cinematography goes, and I do appreciate that it all wasn't CGI nonsense, but the end result was just too silly for me. There is also too much frantic comedy in this movie. There was always comedy in Lethal Weapon 1, 2, and 3, but the fourth movie goes off the charts, and that's not a good thing. The comedy in this movie is more cringy than it is funny. Now, I love a comedy, but I prefer my comedy in comedies. Humor is fine in any genre. The human species is a species that laughs, so any movie that has people in it can have humor in it, but this movie overdoes it, especially with the Leo Getz and Chris Rock characters. One scene in particular is in a dentist's office where they're questioning a bad guy with nitrous oxide while Leo is distracting a dentist with a fake toothache. It's all hard to watch. It's too silly. It feels more like the hospital scene in the movie Basketball than it does an actual scene from a real cop drama. A comedy can play it straight and be funny. A straight movie that becomes silly just becomes silly. Earlier in the film, there was a murder where somebody waiting at a train crossing is pushed into the train crossing, which I thought was rather clever, but they tried to do that thing a little later in the movie with Riggs, which is kind of silly because how did the bad guys know that Riggs would be stuck behind a railroad crossing at that exact time in that exact place, and that there would be a train coming in the first place? I frequently applaud a good setup and payoff in storytelling, so the earlier train murder and the second train murder attempt do connect to each other, but the method of the murder is just a bit too illogical for me to accept. There are much better ways to kill characters in a movie than this. The overall plot of the movie involved a Chinese gang, counterfeiting, human trafficking, but unless the viewer is prepared to take notes, the plot is a little bit hard to follow because it's unnecessarily complex, and when plot points are presented to you, they're often done rather quickly at a frantic pace and details are easy to miss. But that really doesn't matter because it's all an excuse to have gunfights and action, which this movie does very well, especially with Jet Li. The martial arts action is very good. I appreciate the way the movie looks. It feels very Lethal Weapon-y, and I like that about this movie. It's fun. It's just a fun movie, and what more can you ask for? Despite its silliness, which goes too far, it is fun, and I like that. The movie has a charming ending with the birth of Riggs' kid and Roger's grandkid on the same day in the same hospital, because why not? The bottom line is that these movies try too hard. They know what makes these movies work, and they push those elements to the breaking point. I like the musical composition of all four movies. Michael Kamen and Eric Clapton were great together. Kamen is no longer with us, may he rest in peace, but Eric Clapton is. I hope they bring Eric Clapton back for Lethal Weapon 5 if a Lethal Weapon 5 actually gets made. With all that being said, while Lethal Weapon 3 and 4 do not quite live up to Lethal Weapon 1 and 2, this quadrilogy is great, and I love all 4 of these movies, and they're fun to watch all in a row like I did for the preparation of this video. I'm going to do more of this. I'm going to watch a lot more stuff and rewatch a lot more stuff, do some reaction videos. Please hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of it. Until next time, thank you for watching.